Now for our featured story of the day. Will the United States literally dump their gold reserves for Bitcoin for their strategic Bitcoin reserve? Well, let's break this down. We've been hinting this for a while, as there's many net neutral ways for the United States to acquire Bitcoin. So is this the dawn of a new reserve era, from gold to treasuries to Bitcoin? Let's break her down. The U.S. has long relied on the U.S. dollar and U.S. treasuries as the twin pillars of its economic, fiscal, and monetary strategies. But what happens when all these instruments lose their luster and become lackluster? According to the Bitcoin Policy Institute, head of policy, Zack Shapiro, the current financial system is entering a historic inflection point. In a recent interview they shared with the Bitcoin Policy Hour, noting that the U.S. announces we are buying 1 million Bitcoin is just a global seismic shock. In fact, we covered that in great detail yesterday, that the Bitcoin price, they believe, the Bitcoin Policy Institute, would soar, literally skyrocket to 1 million per coin just off the announcement of the U.S. purchasing 1 million Bitcoin. They say we'll probably go very quickly to something like $1 million per pretty little bitty going up forever, Laura. And while the changing monetary order, a potential movement from treasuries as the reserve asset towards the bitty, is largely evident for those with eyes to see, the paths that can be taken on that journey are a myriad of gold's role is the largest question mark facing the market. Recent discussions around revaluing the U.S. gold holdings, still officially priced at $42 per ounce, the derivatives, could unleash nearly $1 trillion in new purchasing power should the United States decide to draw upon it. What would the U.S. do with that windfall? Well, the Bitcoin Policy Institute's policy thinkers are right. It might be deployed to acquire a strategic Bitcoin reserve in a budget-neutral manner, precisely, in alignment with the remit of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Executive Order recently signed by the Trumpster. Now, gold is ancient, Bitcoin is strategic. And one of my favorite quotes from Max Kaiser, gold is the poor man's Bitcoin, which is right in alignment here. Gold is ancient, Bitcoin strategic. According to Matthew Pines, executive director of BPI, frames the choice in stark geoeconomic terms. In terms of strategic leverage, there is an asymmetric advantage for the United States to having Bitcoin monetized relative to gold. Pines went to note that the U.S. and its population owns 35% of all the Bitcoin in circulation, a ratio that gives Washington serious incentive to prefer digital over metallic money. Gold, despite its historical credibility, is centralizable, expensive to transport, and incompatible with the 21st century economy. And while central banks continue stacking it as a hedge against the weaponization of treasuries, its utility as a modern reserve asset remains constrained. Bitcoin, by contrast, is fast, global, and increasingly liquid, a networked form of monetary energy that sidesteps the geopolitical choke points that define traditional finance. The post-dollar world has already begun. The dollar remains dominant but fragile, according to Shapiro, citing Triffin's dilemma, noting how the U.S. must increasingly choose between domestic economic goals and the international demand of the reserve currency issuance. Sanctions like those imposed on Russia's dollar reserves in 2022 shook the global confidence in the neutrality of the U.S. assets. And since then, foreign central banks have responded by moving rapidly into the gold, and in some cases into the pretty little bitty going up forever, Laura. The Treasury is becoming less of a neutral reserve asset, according to Shapiro. Reference escalating disorder in the bond markets and the U.S. perceived politicization of the financial power. And I also may add the de-dollarization from the U.S. dollar, such as the BRICS movement being a great example of that. Yet both he and Pine stress that the America still has tools, and Bitcoin may be the most potent amongst them. By shifting revenues into the bitty, the U.S. could reduce reliance on debt issuance. In fact, we can reduce up to 50% or more of the debt, according to Lummis, just by establishing a strategic, Bitcoin reserve, or maybe offloading the gold and trading it for the apex predator here, and securing asymmetric leverage in a digitized world. The act from a position of strength in competition with a geopolitical rival such as China and Russia. And may I remind you, there's only enough room for one country superpower, Bitcoin superpower in the world. So whatever country is going to be the first to stack 1 to 5 million Bitcoin will most likely be the only one to do so and become a literal Bitcoin superpower. Will it be the US? Will it be China? Will it be Russia? What are your thoughts? The strategic Bitcoin reserve, is it a national imperative? Yeah, man. Under the executive order now got in the Trumpster administration, the Bitcoin strategy departments like the Treasury and Commerce are already exploring the budget neutral path. Michael Saylor already laid out a dozen plus viable options for the administration to acquire Bitcoin. And one of them is revaluing their gold holdings. And also we need to do the audit already at Fort Knox to understand if we even have it. And also selling surplus federal assets, which could include real estate, gold, and spectrum rights. Also, what about just printing money out of thin air and trading it for the hardest asset in human history? Or using tariff revenues or royalties. In fact, we can reduce the entire national debt using any of these methods as well. Pines emphasizes the urgency of the institutional execution. She says words matter, especially when they come from the White House. He said, my bad. And an executive order stating Bitcoin is strategic. It itself is a global signal. However, he also heightened the bureaucratic inertia as the real challenge. Obviously, they're still enemies of Bitcoin. There's a massive difference between the speed at which the White House wants to move and the ability of the federal bureaucracy to follow. You know what I mean? Now, from theory to detonation, the global fallout of the U.S. with the Bitcoin pivot. If America were to allow through on large-scale acquisition of the Biddy, the effects would be both immediate and far-reaching. Other nation states will see that they can't be left behind, sparking the global hash wars, coined by Max Kaiser. And I think that's just a given. Would that spark Russia and China to try to get the first mover's advantage, becoming the Bitcoin superpower of the world? I think so. Both Shapiro and Pines agree. Whatever your view on the Triffin's dilemma or the monetary policy history, Bitcoin is now too strategic to ignore. Bitcoin is indispensable. Wherever we're going next, it's going to help us get there. So whether the U.S. will truly dump gold is yet to be determined. I think it's likely. What are your thoughts? But to quote the late Charlie Munger, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. The incentives, given the U.S. and China competition, the game theory, and America's relative dominance with regards to the domestic Bitcoin holdings suggests and about face on gold would very well be on the cards. But you let me know. Obviously, we hold the cards, not China. China doesn't hold the cards. We hold the cards. Nippinator holds the cards. So let me know your thoughts, family, and I'll read your comments out loud and welcome everyone to the Q&A segment of the live stream.